of two-part Q&A for this weekend of Black Friday. Happy Black Friday to everybody. I hope your shopping has gone well and everything, and maybe you're settling into a leftover turkey sandwich with a lot of salt on it, some mayonnaise and cheese. Maybe you're having some leftover stuffing. Leftovers have become a huge part of the Thanksgiving tradition, especially here in the United States. Probably in Canada too, but their Thanksgiving is in October, a different day of gratitude altogether. So welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. This is Friendly Neighborhood History, and for the next hour or so, we will be doing a live Q&A, Ask Me Anything, social studies, history-related, geopolitics, social sciences. We do this every Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Saturdays at 7 p.m. It's always great to see everybody, and my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, is holding down the chat. He has my social media handles. Be sure to subscribe here on YouTube, just like the wise man said, and follow me on those social media handles to get some more content and posts and information. I try to do more exclusive content on those forums as well. Being a friendly neighborhood historian has never been easier. All you have to do is like and subscribe. And like I said, tonight and tomorrow, come to the live streams, ask some questions, drop some comments and ideas, topics you want to see that discussed, different historical issues and things of that nature. Of course, today is Black Friday, the day when Americans go out after a day of gratitude, supposedly, and chop their tails off, trying to buy as much as they possibly can, investing very highly in the consumer culture, leaning into consumerism ahead of the upcoming holiday, Christmas. And for a lot of people, this is the first appropriate day to listen to Christmas music, put up Christmas lights. This is the first year that I really didn't care. I was listening to Christmas music as early as the end of Halloween. And I'll be putting up my Christmas tree later tonight. So getting ready for the holidays. Last year I didn't have my Christmas tree. I got a plastic one this year, or last year. Didn't put it up until Christmas Eve, so that was too late. And this year I'm trying to do it nice and early and get everything out of the way. Need to buy more Christmas lights and all that good stuff. So yeah, for the next hour or so, we will be talking all things history and social sciences. Any questions you have regarding those different topics, I am here to bring about. We are here every Friday and Saturday evenings. Start your weekend off the right way on Fridays and continue it on Saturdays before you go out and party with your friends, asking questions about history, social sciences, geopolitics, all of the above, both past and present. That is what I am here for. That is what this channel does. We've been doing these live streams and we've had a lot of fun with them ever since the middle of the summer. We had a really great one on Wednesday where we discussed the true meaning and history behind Thanksgiving and delved in some content there. And who doesn't love history? Am I right, father figure? You're absolutely right. I love history too. I'm thinking that we will be doing our live stream lecture on Sunday, despite doing one on Wednesday. We will be doing another live stream lecture. So it's usually a three-part live stream. You get 2 Q&As, Fridays at 8, Saturdays at 7, Eastern Standard Time, and then Sundays, 4 p.m. I come back with a live stream lecture about topics that I'm interested in. We started doing this in the summer. Your name's fine. Don't worry about your name at all. But then we started off in the summer, Saturday afternoons Q&A, and then we added Sundays because more people had more questions and all sorts of stuff they wanted to ask about and talk about. And if you are joining us, this is the Friendly Neighborhood History channel where we talk about all things social sciences and social studies. Drop a comment, question, topic you want to discuss in the chat, and I will get to it at an appropriate time. And then Sunday afternoons, we added just a few weeks ago, we are doing 3 live streams. Fridays and Saturdays are the Q&A. Sundays, I talk about whatever topic I want to talk about. I used to try to get to them during the Q&A, but there are so many great questions from so many great people that we eventually just added a live stream lecture where I talk about historical topics that are relevant to me. And if you are interested in learning about the history of Thanksgiving, I have a full-length video, a couple of short-length videos, and an entire live stream lecture from Wednesday, a special we did on Thanksgiving Eve, where I talked about the history of this very important holiday. I'm glad history is your favorite subject. It's definitely mine too. So any topics you want to talk about, any questions you want to ask about, I am here to discuss them with you. This is what we will be doing for the next hour or so. We are trying to grow the channel, hit 6,000 subscribers by the end of the year. So please like and subscribe. Becoming a friendly neighborhood historian doesn't involve giving me any money, but if you like and subscribe, that makes you a friendly neighborhood historian. And we're trying to get a legion, 6,000, within about a month by the end of the year. So we'll be doing more holiday-themed live stream lectures and topics throughout the month of December. I'm really looking forward to that as we go through the Advent season with all of you. So really looking forward to that. History is my favorite subject. Mine too, definitely. Any period, any geographical era, that's what we're here for. Interesting. You went to argue about Ukraine. You want to argue about Ukraine. That's interesting. Well, the Ukraine war looks like it's winding down. President Zelensky today said that he is willing to deal with Putin and give certain lands up in order for an end to the war. The U.S. foreign policy seems to be shifting under the re-entry of Donald Trump as president. and the U.S. pursuing more neo-isolationist policies may want to end the war in Ukraine as soon as possible. Both sides at different points during the war have intimated that they would like the war to end as well, so we'll see if that comes up. Yeah, I like to talk about the history. I like to focus on why things are happening, not the things that are happening so much. So if there's a lot of history pertaining to the Ukraine-Russia conflict and Poland and all of those things. And there's a lot of recent history and there's a lot of ancient history that goes back about 1,000 years that you can ask about and learn about here on the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, where we talk all history from all different types of the world. We have people visiting us from all the different continents, asking all sorts of different questions, and we really love having everyone come and join. And people are surprised to find that an American such as myself actually knows a little bit about the history of places like India or Pakistan or the Middle East. And I try to do my best and be as objective and fair as possible, and I think I do a pretty good job. And I know that's the case because a lot of people tell me that I am either a right-wing conspiracy theorist or a left-wing nut job. So, interestingly enough. And I hope everyone did have a wonderful Thanksgiving and everything. We put up a very nice post, and there's plenty of content, such as my live stream lecture from Wednesday and a full-length video about Thanksgiving, which I believe is the most inclusive holiday of all time. It is not religiously based, at least ostensibly, and anyone can practice it from any background, any race, ethnicity, or creed. So, how did Father Figure, who I'm glad to see here, came onto the chat right away, is asking, how did the United Kingdom colonize Guyana? I believe that was in the late 1700s. After the 1820s, the United States really starts to crack down on European countries colonizing the Caribbean and Latin America. Starting in the 1810s and 1820s, most of those Latin American countries, which were previously colonized by the Spanish and the Portuguese, start to gain their independence from Spain and Portugal. Brazil gains its independence with Pedro I, who becomes an emperor of Brazil in the 1820s. Basically, because Napoleon invaded Spain and put his brother in charge of the country, and because there was a civil war in Spain and a revolution against Joseph Bonaparte, there was a bunch of political upheaval all throughout the Spanish colonies. So because of the fighting in Europe and the destabilization of both the Portuguese and Spanish throne in the 1810s, Latin American countries like Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela started to look for their independence and started to achieve it thanks to the efforts of people like Dom Pedro I, the Emperor of Brazil, who split Brazil off from the Portuguese sphere of influence, and of course Simón Bolívar, who broke away Venezuela and Colombia, and of course has the country of Panama named after him. So, so I don't know exactly when the British colonized Guyana. By the 1820s, the United States, with the Monroe Doctrine, is saying they don't want Europeans colonizing lands in North or South America. Interestingly enough, in the early 1700s, the Scottish had a colony called New Caledonia, which Caledonia is the ancient name for Scotland given by the Romans. New Caledonia, which is now in modern-day Panama, but tensions with the Spanish and an inability to control the natives, uprisings led to bankruptcy and failure for the Scottish colonial company there, and actually forced Scotland to join with England in 1707 and become one country. So Scotland becomes one country with England, even though they had the same monarch, because of the failure of New Caledonia and the Scottish colonial regions. So some interesting history there, but basically the British had taken Jamaica from the Spanish, and in taking Guyana, they were able to have a bulwark against Spanish autonomy and hegemony over the region. And they controlled Guyana, I think, until the 1960s was when it was finally gained its independence. I don't know a huge amount about that, but that's the basic outline of it. In 1823, President Monroe, worried about the Spanish trying to recolonize areas they were losing, issued the Monroe Doctrine, where he said the Latin American countries are no longer available to be colonized by the European powers, which was a huge statement because it was basically saying the old world stays in the old world, the new world stays in the new world, and it was the first time an American president, but not the last certainly, a U.S. president spoke on behalf of the Latin American peoples and for both the North and South American continents. So some interesting stuff there. If you like what you hear, if you like what you're learning about, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Father Figure, I hope I answered your question. I don't know a huge amount, but I'm willing to look more into it to give you a fuller answer. Let me look more into it. Come back tomorrow and I can tell you even more. Texas Repo, I like history as well. I like World War II history, particularly the Pacific Theater. Absolutely a fascinating bit of history. There are some people who don't like history except for their interest in World War II and warfare in the modern sense in the last century, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Video games, First-person shooter video games like Medal of Honor and Call of Duty have created an entire niche of people who may not know anything about her history, but are interested in the history of war, particularly modern warfare in the last century. So I'm really glad that you have that niche that you're interested in. The Pacific Theater is obviously extraordinarily fascinating. What I'm finding myself, I've learned a lot about it over the years, obviously the Japanese and the United States, but something I'm interested in learning more about now is Japan before the United States got involved in the conflict, taking over Southeast Asia, from the French, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, obviously taking over the Philippines, the death marches of Bataan, and of course their invasion into China in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Interestingly enough, the Japanese also tried to invade India. They attacked Burma, as well as went through Thailand. Thailand actually retained its autonomy during World War II because they allowed the Japanese army to go through there to attack the British colonies in Malaysia and Southeastern Asia and the East Indian Islands. Interestingly enough, they got as far as bombing fortresses along the coast of Australia, attacked Papua New Guinea and New Zealand, but the British withheld them, and with the help of the Americans, eventually turned the tide against them. So I'm learning more about the British side of the war in the Pacific Theater, the involvement of the Japanese in Southeast Asia, and their attacks on Australia, and of course the Second Sino-Japanese War of 1937, which for me is when World War II really begins, when Japan attacks China. So Simon is saying, I was just watching your History Today video and noticed the one about the UN division of modern-day Israel and Palestine. I'm genuinely so interested in history of the region, but it's a shame it just turns into nasty arguments about the most recent. Yeah, definitely. So today I do daily history videos. Thanks for the great plug, Simon, my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, who deserves so much love in the chat. Please give that to him. Basically, the Israel-Palestine conflict, which has been going on for more than 75 years, you could date it that it starts on this day, November 29th, 1947, when the UN agrees to a partition of the land that has the Palestinians taking over Gaza and the southwestern portion of the Levant, where Israel gets the rest, and then the West Bank is given to the Palestinians, or an Arab state, they should say. These are people from what is now Jordan, Lebanon, Syrians, they're Arabs, there's Egyptians, who kind of are all amalgamated, along with local Bedouinic peoples, into the Palestinians that we know today. Jerusalem is divided into quarters. There's an Armenian quarter, Christian quarter, Muslim quarter, and Jewish quarter, and that's how it is to this day. But yes, the history of that region is fascinating and really interesting, and I think a lot of people don't know about it, and that's why they're spouting off stuff on the internet, and a lot of people just get so polarized by the politics and the geopolitics, they're unwilling to look at the history, and that's why I talk about geopolitics, both past and present, and I have been extraordinarily fair in my assessment of that region. I mean, Israel just signed a ceasefire of Hezbollah. Can we get a ceasefire as soon as possible with the Palestinians? I think that would be great. And if we're going to really work for peace, we need to stop war. So, let me see here. Yeah, let's see. Alex Wade, good to see you. Napoleon invaded Mexico during the Monroe Doctrine. Napoleon wasn't in power then. France invaded Mexico a bunch of different times. It was a relative of the Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph named Maximilian, who was also related to Napoleon. Who with the blessing of Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, tried to set up a Franco-European empire in Mexico in the 1860s and failed to do so, and that led obviously to it was Emperor Maximilian I. He set up an empire for a few years in Mexico and was eventually kicked out in 1867. But that was after Napoleon. That's Napoleon III, nephew of Napoleon, who really tried to get the Europeans to take over Mexico in the 1850s and 60s, and it backfired tremendously. And that is why Cinco de Mayo is such an important holiday for the Mexican people. It is not Mexican Independence Day, but is when they defeated the French at the Battle of Puebla in 1862, signaling their ability to retain their autonomy against the French. Oh, Global, great to see you. Why was there a need to take artifacts and collect them from conquered land? Basically for the purposes of researching and understanding the peoples of that land, for transcribing things, for learning ancient languages, cultural indications, things like that. It's obviously there's a great semantical and linguistic advantage with colonizing. When they colonized Egypt, the British got their hands everywhere. You have Howard Carter going into the Valley of the Kings and Tutankhamun's tomb. And I think the best example of an artifact being used to teach modern peoples about the ancient world is the Rosetta Stone, which taught a lot about ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics and things like that. I think it's also a way to show cultural domination and colonization, and is really, really dangerous at the end of the day. So, Kenya, hi, good to see you. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Okay, let me see. Simon was saying what? Sorry about that. What is the best segment you have watched on the History Channel, and what stands out as the worst that you had to change channel? Well, I've had to change channel with the Ancient Aliens things before, Simon. The History Channel, when I was growing up, was actually a place where history was taught. Now it's far more reality TV, Pawn Stars, American Pickers, things like that. These shows are really interesting, and they do teach some history, but they are far more about the money and the prices and memorabilia and things like that, and the items and the capitalist side of it than they are about the actual history. What was I going to say? Uh, yeah, and some of the best segments, they used to do documentaries about actual empires and kingdoms. I loved Engineering an Empire, where they had different ancient and modern empires like the Romans, the Greeks, the British, and they actually discussed their history and things like that. So, yeah, so Simon, Engineering an Empire, series on the presidents, series on different. They had a great series on the great documentary on the Dark Ages, things like that. Were you there? No, I was not, and I'm assuming neither were you. Yeah, nobody talks about that, and that's a really important thing, British. A lot of colonial, what makes World War One and World War Two particularly significant is that as soon as these empires, the French, the British, the Germans, the Russians, were drummed into the conflict, all of their colonial lands were drummed into the conflict. So you have Africans fighting other Africans between the British, French, and Germans in World War One. And every time the British fought, the Indian troops were fighting Raj troops, what were formerly called sepoys, fighting against Japanese. So you had Indian British soldiers invading China and fighting against Japanese forces during World War II, which is quite interesting. Yeah. Yes, and our wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, is British. Yes, that lamp is, it might very well be, I don't know how old this lamp is, but it's an old one, to be sure. Let me see. Global saying, do historians have conventions, or do they hang out in the back rooms at the museums? They do, and no matter what, whether it's conventions or hanging out in the back rooms, those conventions may be held in the back rooms of museums. We're arguing. Historians love to do two things: write about history and critique written works about history. So yeah, I don't know how I'm talking about Zionism. Zionism, which is a word that is bandied about very, very frivolously these days, simply means believing that the Jewish people have a right to live in the land of Israel, which is their ancient homeland. Which I don't, I guess, and by that definition, I am a Zionist. I am also not anti-Palestinian. So, interestingly enough, you can be two things at once. I'm not sure, Sean. I don't know enough about that. Let me see. Yeah, so Manchester or Bournemouth. Yeah. Joseph is saying, didn't the French Foreign Legion go to war with Mexico, and the general of the French Foreign Legion had a one arm? Yeah, I'm trying to remember who you're speaking of. That sounds familiar to me. There was an entire war. The French Foreign Legion did a lot to push French colonialism everywhere. They fought against the Algerians. They fought against the Vietnamese. They were routinely defeated, but they tried to create a French empire with the nephew or the younger brother of Franz Joseph I. His name was Maximilian, and his wife, I'm trying to remember her name. They tried to set up a Mexican, French-inspired empire in Mexico, and it failed totally. Yeah, there were three Napoleons, Alex. So there's Napoleon the First, obviously Bonaparte, the most well-known, the most successful, one of, if not the greatest commanders in European history, created the first French Empire in 1804, famously crowns himself instead of letting the Pope do it to mock the church. He also crowns his wife. Extraordinarily arrogant, extraordinarily successful, defeated 5 or 6 different European coalitions of different forces who were allied against him. So nations would literally ally to defeat Napoleon, and they got beat time and time again. Tried to destroy the British, wasn't able to. Tried to force the Russians and other people to enter his system where there was an embargo against the British so he could weaken them. The Russians countered him, so he invaded Russia and obviously fails. When he is exiled and returns to power briefly, he tries to win. Before he is exiled, he tries to put his son Napoleon II in power. His throne is never legitimized or recognized, and he is exiled and dies shortly thereafterwards. So Napoleon I and Napoleon II kind of don't go anywhere, or Napoleon II really doesn't go anywhere. And then Napoleon's nephew, who is the president of France in the 1840s, takes over and declares himself emperor to put down rebels in the late 1840s and early 1850s. And he is in charge of France for the next couple of decades. And that is Napoleon III. That is the guy who tries to build a French empire in Mexico. So it's not Napoleon, it's his nephew, Napoleon III. So let's see here. Let's see. If you like what I'm talking about, if you're enjoying this, if you're learning about history, like and subscribe. Tell all your friends and family. Join us again. Drop a top comment or question in the chat. I'm always here to answer them. We'll be going for about another 40 minutes or so. Yeah, profit and the History Channel is more about the money than they are about the history, and their shows are more about the money, like American Pickers and Pawn Stars. Interesting shows, really fascinating stuff that you see there, but not a huge amount of history there. Yeah. How did you ever happy do? Great question. How did you learn all of this? I've read, I've studied, I've learned from other people, I've listened, I've retained, I've watched a lot of documentaries. Watch a good history documentary every weekend and you'll be amazed at how much you can learn. Read a good history book every couple of months, you'll be amazed with how much you can learn. So there's a lot there. Yes, and as Simon is propping me up, I have a master's in history. Yes. Yeah, sheer passion, intelligence, but also a love of the subject. At the end of the day, I find history to be extremely important because history is the story of humanity and the human condition, and I think it blends the content of theories and ideas with the human experience, and I think it's extraordinarily important. I think it teaches us about human psychology, human politics, human relationships, in ways that those regular fields of poli-sci and psychology cannot because of the history there. Yeah, Joey, do you think the Middle East will return to pre-Islam area? Well, that's a great question, Joey. I really like that era anytime soon. No, I don't think so. Islam is able to control the Middle East and has for 1,500 years, not because it is extraordinarily popular, but because it is extraordinarily fierce. Islam's first century is a series of conquests from the death of Muhammad to their defeat at the Battle of Tours in 732. They literally spread through the sword. They're able to destroy the Sassanid Persian Empire. They're able to greatly weaken the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire. And they're able to conquer all of Israel in the Middle East, North Africa, called the Maghreb, and Spain. And they build a huge empire, first called the Umayyad Caliphate, then called the Abbasid Caliphate. And through the centuries, different Muslim kingdoms and empires have arisen that have been able to hold on to them. It's only now that that uniformity has been challenged by the Europeans after World War I and the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, carving up the region into different countries like Iraq, Syria, Iran, things like that. These are all European creations. They did not exist in the past. Iran was Persia. There were Persian Muslim empires like the Timurid Empire, or the Safavid Empire. The Ottoman Turks were obviously very powerful. The Mamluk Sultanate, which was a kingdom of Muslims. A sultanate is a Muslim kingdom. A caliphate is a Muslim country led by the Islamic religion, which usually controls Mecca and Medina. The Mamluk Sultanate was able to defeat the Mongols and send them back. The Ilkhanate was the Mongols who controlled Persia for a long time, and they became Muslims and adapted to the culture of Islam. The Umayyads became the Moors, or the Almoravids in Spain, and they held on to Spain for centuries, keeping the Christians under their thumb. And of course, the most famous Muslim empire are the Ottomans, who controlled virtually all of the Middle East, all of the Balkans and southeastern Europe and North Africa for centuries. And so by the ability to control, oppress, suppress, and also to some extent tolerate different viewpoints, rely on trade networks and the wealth of both the Orient and the East and the Europeans in the West, those Muslim kingdoms and empires became extremely successful and extraordinarily wealthy. But I think that in doing that, Islam became ingrained in that areas, so that regions that were once majority Jewish or Christian were now vast majority Muslim, and will stay that way. Egypt is 90% Muslim, and that's not changing anytime soon. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. It has the best birth rates. And so I don't think the pre-Islamic era is coming at any point. in the Middle East. The only difference now is you have different countries that have been carved up by the Europeans, which now have Islamic governments, such as Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, places like that. So let me see here. Rodolfo, great to see you. Always happy to hear you. Peter, I am very pleased to hear that. You are from New Zealand. Am I seeing that from your, or Australia? Am I seeing that in your handle correctly? Yes, I do know history. If you've been listening, you realize, Big Papa, that I enjoy history. Yes, we are on our way to getting monetized. And if you like and subscribe like Peter Shane the Great just did, thank you so much. We will get there eventually. And yes, I am very pretty, but not as pretty as Queen Victoria, who was deeply in love with her husband, Prince Albert, because they are definitely relationship goals. In fact, because she was a queen, he could not propose to her, so she actually proposed to him in 1841. Before that, she was actually dating. She went on a date with this future Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, and was completely captivated and entranced by him, but Albert became the great love of her life. Queen Victoria, one of the most amazing women in all of history. Yes, we go 1 hour earlier, 7 to 8, and today's 8 to 9. Big Papa is asking about what about the genocide of the indigenous. Now, I've touched on this many times on the channel, and I touched on it on Wednesday's live stream lecture about the first Thanksgiving. I don't think the first Thanksgiving can be conflated with the persecution and the murder and the war against and the dispossession of land for the native peoples. I don't technically believe it is a genocide. I think that to assume it's a genocide is to assume that the Native Americans are all uniform and the Europeans are all uniform. You have different Europeans doing different things. The Spanish destroying the Aztecs and Incans in Central and South America. You have the English in the Eastern Seaboard. You have the Americans throughout most of the 19th century. You have the French, who are actually much nicer to the natives, which is why the natives usually sided with the French in Canada and North America. I don't think that you could call it a genocide so much as you could call it a series of different warfares and dispossessions, which were really awful and often ended up in terrible circumstances. But I think we throw the term genocide around too easily these days. So let me see. You have a doctorate. That's amazing. Yeah, I am very antique. I'm doing my best, except I'm not Granny. Free Palestine. Free Palestine from whom and to whom? I believe in completely freeing the Palestinians. I believe in freeing the Palestinians from Hamas. Fair. I think that's fair. Yeah. I love historical artifacts, so this fits the decor of a historian. I mean, all I need now is the pipe. Oh, wait. There we are. Let me see here. I'll have to read that, Michael. Thank you for your suggestion. Oh, wow, from Iraq. Welcome, Anas. Thank you. Great to see you. The Middle East is a difficult place to live, but it's a beautiful place to live. There's so much history and culture there, and Iraq is in the middle of all of it. This is the land of the ancient Babylonians. This is the land of King Nebuchadnezzar the Great, the Paleo-Babylonians, the ancient Babylonians, the Neo-Babylonians, the Persian Empire. All of these empires have gone through Iraq. It is so important to the Greeks, the Romans, and to the different Muslim states that have emerged. Such a fascinating country with a great history. But thank you for tuning in. It is very late in Iraq. I think it's like, let me see. I think it's like 4 a.m. over there. So, yeah, he does a great job, Peter. He really takes care of a lot of people, and he keeps things pretty set up. And he used to just come to the channel and watch, and then one day he was like, I'm tired of all the trolls interrupting the history. I'm going to take care of that for you. And he is here almost without fail every single time. He's amazing, and we don't deserve him. He's not the hero we deserve, but he's the hero we need. How can you tell the difference between a scream and a yawn if you're... I don't understand, Virginia. I imagine you would not. I don't know who Peter Zahan is. Australia. Wow, thank you so much for watching. Oh, you're watching basketball. I love basketball. Free Israel. Free Israel from who? That's an interesting one. I'm not clowning. I've used the pipe on numerous videos before, but since you asked so nicely, I will put it down. Who used poo sticks? Hello, Steele. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate having you here. I think I've actually caught up to the chat, believe it or not. Usually we have, yeah. I'm really glad to have you here and have found the channel, so really appreciate that. So, does anyone have, if you're enjoying what you're learning, if you enjoy the history I'm talking about, hello, Seth, great to see you. Always a pleasure, Seth. Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Again, trying to hit 6,000 by the end of the year. Also, right now, trying to avoid the food coma from the leftovers. I am not in a haunted house, although I've oftentimes thought it was haunted because of the spaciousness and things like that. But if you like learning about history, if you enjoy social studies and social sciences, consider liking and subscribing. Check out my long form content. I had a video about the history of Thanksgiving that just dropped the other day. I did a long live stream on that. We are trying to reach a Legion 6,000. So please like and subscribe and ask any questions you want. I don't believe they had a community stick. They might have in their baths. The Roman baths were actually extraordinarily deep and intricate, and they weren't just places where people would go to bathe. They had forums, or they would have rooms where people would debate. They had saunas, they had pools. They had small markets and cafes and things like that. So the Roman bath system, which I believe is where you're getting this idea of a communal reciprocatory for people relieving themselves. These places were where people would go and discuss geopolitics, ask questions. They would have debates. They would read. They would listen to music or live readings, things like that. And so the baths were actually extraordinarily intricate. They were labyrinths with different layers and levels to them, and different rooms and chambers. The Romans built many different baths. They were known for their good public sanitation, their clean running water, thanks to their aqueducts. And the real breakdown of the Roman Empire is seen when the infrastructure, such as those aqueducts and bathhouses, start to break down in the 4th and 5th century. The last great series of baths were built by the very, very vicious and otherwise notoriously nasty Roman Emperor Caracalla, who was actually very successful with his building project of the baths. So the baths are extraordinarily important to Roman history and for Roman community and discussions and things like that. Thomas, I am not related to him. I do not know who you were referring to. Joseph, hello, welcome, thank you. Yeah, we take toilet paper for granted. Human beings, throughout most of history, have used their hands, tree bark, things that are not as comfortable as 2-ply, 4-ply toilet paper. Okay, ever happy dude. Was Nixon really that bad of a man or statesman? Yeah, I think so. I think Richard Nixon suffered from a couple of problems. I think if you look at his presidency, he was actually a very successful president. He was moderate, he was thoughtful, he was resourceful. He had done what he could to end the Vietnam War successfully. He created the Environmental Protection Agency. He started affirmative action for African Americans who had been left behind because they had lost out on civil rights for so many generations. I think he had his definite strengths. He was a brilliant statesman, going to China and driving a further wedge between communist China and the Soviet Union, really strengthened America's geopolitical standpoint and brought the Russians to the drawing table, forced them to deal and to limit their amount of nuclear weapons and things like that. So I think Nixon was a skillful politician. I think he was able to make a huge political comeback after he lost the presidency in 1960 to John F. Kennedy. He ran for governor of California in 1962 and said you lost badly. Said you wouldn't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Came back in 1968 for some more kicking and won the presidency in a very turbulent year, and then won a huge re-election in 1972. Nixon was a very successful, very smart politician, very shrewd. But he was also very paranoid, and he had corruption going back decades. Even when he was becoming on the road to becoming vice president, there were rumors of him being corrupt, of taking political gifts and donations and bribes. Of course, he gave a speech where he said the only thing that he ever took was a dog named Checkers, a Cocker Spaniel. Nixon was known for being corrupt, but he was also known for being very paranoid. He had an enemies list of people in the culture, newspaper writers, journalists, celebrities, other politicians, foreign figures who were on his enemies list, who he believed were a threat not just to the United States, but to himself. I think he already had shown some signs of corruption. Then he showed signs of paranoia. And of course, Watergate, which brought him down, was his biggest flub up, because he obviously didn't need to break into Democratic Party headquarters, but he did it. And while he might not be the only politician to spy or try to use different means to game the system and get a heads up on his political opponents, he certainly got caught at it. And rather than admitting it, which would have probably saved his presidency, he lied about it and forced other people to lie for him, leading to, and thinking that the president was above the law, he basically lost out on everything. probably would have been impeached and removed from office if he had not resigned in favor of Gerald Ford, and probably could have gone to prison for his obstruction of justice and his blocking of the American legal system if he had not been pardoned by Vice President Ford, who became president after him. So Nixon ended in disgrace despite many successes and great victories during his presidency. So ever happy, I do think Nixon was bad in many, many ways, but I think he's treated as worse than he probably was, and he had a lot of successes that people don't want to talk about because of his failures. And I think it shows something, and history is always teaching us something about ourselves. And when we look at a figure like Richard Nixon, I think the lesson we garner is we are very quick to focus on the negatives and only the negatives, and we don't want to say anything good about someone who we view negatively. We're not willing to be balanced or critical thinkers and say, hey, there's some good things here and there's some bad things about it. So Richard Nixon is definitely a case of the good, the bad, and ugly with an American president. But anyways, Anas is saying, I don't care about the history of Iraq. I don't have electricity, safety, water, good internet, people, food safety. Sorry for ranting, but people think Iraq is a normal. No, I've heard that it's really difficult living there. Obviously, there's a lot of political turbulence. There's a very unstable government. There's still ISIS running around. It is not advanced. It is a developing country in many ways, and it's had definitely its issues. So I'm very sorry to hear, and thoughts and prayers are definitely needed for the country of Iraq. And I don't know what to do. I think that destabilizing the region 20 years ago was one of the biggest geopolitical mistakes the United States has ever made. But Anas, I'm very sorry to hear about that. But yeah. Yeah, 100 souls. Yeah, the Spartans are fascinating people, incredibly strong, great warriors, reasonable fighters, very powerful, very fierce. They actually, of all the Greek city-states, despite being so brutish and strong-willed and macho, if you want to use that word, they were actually the most egalitarian. Women were educated. They could own land and hold political office. They couldn't be the rulers, but women had an important role because for them, raising a child to be strong and powerful meant everything, and women raised children in that day and age, so women needed to be strong and powerful and educated and smart, and women would determine the mettle. The mettle of a man was determined by the strength, zeal, and wisdom of his mother. The Spartans were very tenacious, extremely great warriors, and lived by a code of conduct. You could compare them, if you like Star Trek, to the Klingons. To some extent, these people who believed in honor and bravery and duty and zeal, that were not known so much for their art, their poetry, and their philosophy like the Athenians were, but were known for their strength and power and cunning. And that's part of how they won the Peloponnesian War against against their fellow Greeks, the Athenians. Another interesting thing to notice is how brutal they were. They were often ruthless and bloodthirsty. I mean, if a child was born with any sort of defect or was not deemed to be strong enough, he would be put out and left to be basically eaten by the wolves, left to the elements to die. They were not beyond infanticide in order to create as strong of a people group as they could. So I'm so glad you got interested in history by learning about the Spartans, and you probably knew some of those things, but I hope you learned a little bit more. Let me see here. So Simon's talking to somebody named Franklin. I didn't see Franklin. He is a yeah. Okay, I read one of those. So Franklin he is a free speech absolutist, but scroll up to my original comment. If we just argue about geopolitics, yeah, I'm fine with people arguing and bringing up questions and stuff like that in the chat, especially during a live stream lecture where I'm not focused on the chat. But this is a place for questions and comments and learning about history and things like that. Ray, welcome. Good to see you. And Simon is reminding you of that, Franklin, so please keep that in mind. No one cares about the baths. Well, the people who brought them up care about them. And why are you Islamophobic? I am not Islamophobic. Okay, Islamophobia does exist. I think it exists in a small number. People sometimes have an unnatural fear of people who are Islamic. Why is there no such thing as Christophobic? Why is there no such thing as Judeophobic? I mean, anti-Semitic maybe. Why is there no such thing as Hinduphobic? It's always Islamophobic, and I don't think that. I think it's way too easily applied. I think it's possible to be Islamophobic or to be bigoted against Muslims, absolutely, and that's horrible. But this is such a key buzzword for so many people when counterexamples of it don't exist for other religions except maybe anti-Semitism. And so I'm not Islamophobic. I have no hatred of Islam or anything like that. I am telling the history of a region of the world and what it is determined by. That history also includes the Islamic Golden Age, the Islam. I mentioned the Islamic countries and societies being extremely cosmopolitan, extremely advanced, Algebra was invented by the Muslims. Many modern medicines were invented by the Muslims. Thomas Aquinas and the ever great Western philosophers could not have gotten where they got if it wasn't for people like Averroes and others who translated the works of Aristotle and commented on them. Maimonides, one of the greatest scholars of Jewish scholars of all time, lived in Islamic Spain and gloried in living in such a tolerant and cosmopolitan area. I've talked about this a lot on the channel. The Islamic Golden Age is a really powerful and interesting era in Islamic history. That does not shadow or compare to radical Islamism that we are struggling with right now in the Middle East. And the biggest people who are struggling with them are Islamic. So maybe they're the Islamophobes and I'm not. Yeah, wine and a big bath doesn't sound like a good combination. Yeah, but the Romans loved their wine and they loved to sit and drink and just discuss things and to relax with a glass of wine. I mean, a lot of people enjoy a glass of wine, stuff like that. Hi, welcome, Invisible. Do you like Trump or Kamala? Well, the election's already over. I made an entire, if you want to learn more about, I don't give my opinion, but I give as objective as possible perspective as I can. And when I realized the American presidential election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump was going to be historic, I got right on it and I released I did a weekly This Week in Politics video. You can go and watch the playlist. I've got 2 full-length videos in which I discuss the election and its results, and I make an official prediction. I believed that Trump was going to win. He won by an even more substantial amount than I believed he would. We'll see what he does next. So, Justin, started war on drugs. What are you referring to? Who started the war on drugs? Was it Nixon? I believe it was Reagan who really got the ball rolling on the war on drugs. Franklin, I've given my opinion, my thoughts on Israel versus Palestine. I think there should be a way for these two sides to coexist. They can't coexist when they are fighting a war. And I talk about the history of that and basically the inability of either side to accept a reasonable outcome where one side has a certain amount of land is true. And here's some historical facts. Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, who did his darndest to make sure his people had their own state in the Levant, was given 95% of what he wanted in a treaty agreement at the Oslo Accords in 1994. He won the Nobel Prize for his efforts along with Shimon Peres, the president of Israel. He turned it down. He was pressured by the Palestinians, his Palestinian cohorts, to turn it down, and he turned it down. Many of the treaties and agreements that the Israelis have offered to the Palestinians in which a two-state solution has been possible have been turned down by the Palestinians because they don't get every single last thing they want. And if you ever go to a negotiation table thinking you want to get everything you want, this is an important life lesson, by the way, you won't. You don't get everything you want at a negotiation table. You're supposed to give and take. A lot of the problems in that region have been because of obstinance, and both sides are guilty of it. I am not biased. I want both sides to be able to live in that land. You can't have that when one side is teaching their children to kill the other side. It's just not going to happen. We need to end that war as soon as possible, and we need to find a way for Muslim and Jew to coexist. But I don't see how that's going to happen anytime soon. And the proliferation of the war by the Israelis is only making people more and more angry and more bitter towards them, which is not going to breed any sort of solution right now. I believe there's a lot of tunnel vision on the part of the Israelis right now, and they've kind of lost their way. And I don't think diplomacy or a two-state solution is going to reign anytime soon in that region, with one side tired of constant terrorist activity and the other side promulgating that terrorist activity. I think you've basically got a case where it's just going to be unchecked warfare until there's a ceasefire, and that's going to be temporary anyways. Just my opinion. How's that? I think that's very objective, and I think it's based on history, and that's what we do at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. So, Michael, it started in your front yard and ended up in court. That's really interesting. Yeah, basically, Manassas, Bull Run. There were a lot of Civil War battles have two names. The Soviets. The South, which was the conquered, defeated nation of the Civil War, who was rebelling from the United States, they called it Manassas. The North, the Union, called it Bull Run. And there were two battles at Bull Run, and surprisingly, the South won both of them. And Lincoln thought the war would be over. The South thought the war would be over quickly too. But when the Confederates surprisingly won at Bull Run, thanks to the efforts of a general named Thomas Jackson, who basically kept his troops fighting, so they called him a Stonewall Jackson. He refused to move, basically. The victory of the South surprised the North and made everybody realize the war was going to last much longer. Every brutal, nasty war in history started off as a war people thought would end very quickly. World War I was that, and so is the Civil War. Yes, thank you, Simon, for backing me up there. I really appreciate that. Let me see here. Yes, Michael, I agree. Nixon definitely got his hands caught in the cookie jar, and he might have been forgiven because people were like, okay, I get it. It would have hurt him, it would have damaged his legacy, and it would have left a lot of question marks behind him. But his refusal to admit that he had done it, his demanding that he had not done it, his gaslighting of the American people, him using his operatives to lie to people, and then when it finally became almost undeniable that he had done it, he basically said, well, I had a right to do it. That obstinance is what cost Nixon. It's the same obstinance I was just talking about with the Israel-Palestine issue. I haven't killed anyone, so thank God for that, and I hope I never have to do. I don't know what kind of question that is, but you got an answer. It's global. Jimmy Carter pardoned draft dodgers that went to Canada. Why did he not have a parade for returning soldiers? Yes, so Jimmy Carter, yeah. I think that, I would have a very moderate perspective here. I think draft dodgers should have gotten pardoned because not fighting against a war that you don't believe in is a fair point. I think the draft had at that point run out of its course. I don't think that Vietnam posed nearly as an existential threat that World War II did. And so I think that Jimmy Carter proved in many cases to be way in over his head and not be firm enough. I mean, part of the reason we were just talking about the Middle East, part of the reason Iran is as destabilized and such a problem as it is now is because of Jimmy Carter's inability to handle the revolution properly. Now, there were a lot of problems with the Shah and the dictatorial regime there, but Carter did not learn the lesson that would later be taught again by the Bushes, that you don't go into this region of the world and destabilize these dictators because you don't know what you're going to get in result. By not propping up the Shah, who had been an ally of the United States, Carter made a way for radical Islam to rule the day in Iran, which has, out of a frying pan into the fire, a much hotter fire in the case of Iran. He pardoned draft dodgers and things like that, which I can understand doing that, but there has been a lot of hatred and mistreatment of Vietnam veterans, and the government has not done enough job clarifying or having some sort of reasonable, fair response where they say, yes, we understand Vietnam. We understand that that was a mistake, and so many problems happened there, but we appreciate our soldiers being willing to fight and die for the cause of freedom, and we as Americans should rally behind them. So I do not ignore questions. I am a historian. I do not ignore questions, Franklin. I go through them one at a time. It's going in order. Nixon waving goodbye from the helicopter. Let me see here. Yes, I do cover Greek history. I just did 100 Souls. I have videos about that. I've got a really good video about the Diadochi, the 4 kingdoms that were established after Alexander the Great died. Antiochus, Seleucus, Cassander, and Ptolemy, and how basically Seleucus was able to defeat all of them and make the Seleucid Empire in the Middle East. I really appreciate that, Simon. That's very sweet of you to say. Being objective as possible is my goal as a historian. Let me see here. I think I answered that, Michael, about what did you do good. Yes, Franklin. I don't think, again, I think that the term genocide is thrown around way too loosely about this issue. I think it's unfair to call it a genocide. Yes, 40,000 Palestinians have died, and the war needs to stop as soon as possible. But to call that a genocide in the midst of a war, was it a genocide for Nagasaki to get destroyed? What about Dresden? What is a genocide? How do you decide and determine a genocide? I have an entire video where I actually talk about genocide, and I respond to comments by Douglas Murray about genocide. So I know what genocide is. I know how to understand it and how it works separately from war. It often happens during war, such as the Holocaust, but is not necessarily the war itself. Yes, fair. Simon is extremely fair and honest. Franklin, that's the first thing you said that I agree with. Now, Michael, are you again referring to Nixon? I think Nixon creating the EPA. I think Nixon opening up China. I think Nixon finding some sort of resolution to the Vietnam War. I think all those things were pretty good. And he was extremely popular. He won overwhelmingly. I think he made some mistakes. Price controls taking us off the silver standard, which leads to the devaluation of the currency and inflation. I think those were not great ideas, but I think Nixon had a lot of had some strengths. He obviously had an ability. He had a very intelligent mind, and he was able to achieve a lot. And I've talked to liberals who hate Nixon, who have said that he did a lot of good, such as with expanding the welfare state, um, affirmative action, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Okay, so Franklin, I answer the questions of people on this channel as I go through them. And I have been complimented about my ability to hopscotch from one historical topic to another. I was just talking about the ancient Greeks. I was just talking about the Islamic Golden Age. Then I talked about Israel-Palestine. Now I'm talking about Richard Nixon. I'm everywhere all at once, and I was talking about the Civil War. That's what I pride myself in. That's what I enjoy. That's what people here enjoy. That's why people like and subscribe and follow the channel. And if you like what I am saying, or if you disagree vehemently and at least enjoy history, consider liking and subscribing. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you're asking the question. But I promise I am not dodging anything you are asking, and I really appreciate you asking it. Enough. Shabbat. Yeah, isn't it technically Shabbat? It is Friday night. So Shabbat is the Jewish last day of the week, which commemorates the seventh day in the book of Genesis, when God rested from all of his labor and set up that model for the Jewish people to follow. Many Christians and Muslims follow that model of resting after their week. And of course, eventually that model is turned into the very thing that we are in now, the weekend. But yes, Shabbat begins in the Jewish Yom, a day in Judaism. I mean, I've studied Judaism in Israel quite extensively. I've danced in synagogues with rabbis. But Shabbat begins at sundown on Friday night and goes till sundown. So a Yom ends at sundown, starts at sundown, and ends at sundown the next day. So Shabbat doesn't start Friday at midnight or Saturday at midnight. It starts when the sun technically goes down. Now, depending on the level of observance, synagogues will literally start their Shabbat services and their prayer services when the sun goes down or at a particular set time. So a little bit of religious history there. Seth, I'm so glad you're here. He's asking a great question. How did the U.S. and the U.K. become such great allies? What was the one thing that brought us together then when just not too long ago we were such big rivals? So as the 19th century goes along, the United States and Great Britain become friends. Obviously, you got the American Revolution, but you also have the United States fighting the War of 1812, the Second American Revolution against the British, where the British basically decide, okay, they're not going to bug the Americans anymore. Our shared ancestry as mainly English-speaking peoples who were Anglo-Saxon and Protestant brought the two countries together. America's good relations with Canada brought the two countries together. In the 1840s, there was almost war again, but the British and the Americans decided to settle. For decades have been settling the Pacific Northwest, with Americans living in Vancouver, British Columbia, and with British people living in Oregon. And eventually they decided to draw it at the 49th parallel. 54-40 or fight. It was this idea of where do you draw the line? The 54th parallel longitude, or the 40th parallel. And we settled on the 49th, dividing, which is the border between Canada and the United States today. And the eventual decision to settle on that land, which gave the United States Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and the British kept British Columbia, is what has made was a step in that direction. And the continual shared heritage brought them closer. Lincoln, when he originally Britain was interested in legitimizing the Confederacy because they relied on the cotton exports. Ironically, the British had just gotten rid of slavery, but were relying on a slave-based economy. But Lincoln, signing the Emancipation Proclamation, drives a wedge between Britain and the Confederacy during the Civil War. And when it becomes clear that the Americans are, at least ostensibly, for the same freedoms the British are, they have the same political tradition, the two sides start to become a lot closer and more friendly. And obviously that shared heritage and ancestry brings them closer together. The United States legitimizing the British Empire, allowing the British to take land that they want in Africa. And eventually, of course, fighting in World War I think solidifies that the United States will be on the side of the British. For instance, there were people in the United States, especially German immigrants, who wanted the United States to help the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. There were others who wanted the United States to help Britain and France. when President Wilson brings the United States in to help Britain and France in 1917, that ends the divide. That ends any questions about whose side the United States will be on. And from there, I think we've got a firm closeness between the United States and Great Britain that lasts till this day, Seth. So I hope that answers your question there. Saeed is asking, do you think Ukraine will come to an agreement with Russia to end the war if it includes allowing Russia to have the currently conquered parts of Ukraine? It's going to be something like that. Zelensky just today said he's willing to do that. Both sides have intimated at different points that they want to end this war as soon as possible. President-elect Trump, I should say, former President Trump, about to be President Trump, the second president to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms, Mr. Trump, whatever you want to call him, he is saying now that he wants to end the war. His vice president wants to end the war. So I expect the war to be ended. The U.S. using its own weapons in Russia can be seen as an act of war. Putin is threatening nuclear war, which he has done many times during this war, and people are kind of tired of the boy who cried wolf. Putin's power seems to be hell-bent on continuing the war, but his economy is very weak and needs some sort of respite. So I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's the compromise they're going to have to come to. And Peter, I'm so glad you found it. And I'm so glad that you came. Have a great rest of your evening. Yes, it is. I think it probably is 50s or 60s. I like the antique style. Somebody said it's like my halo sitting above me, but yeah. The one over here is more modern. I used to only have this one, and then people asked, so I've got the 2 lights going on. Yeah. Let me see here. Simon, last time, war is very... Yeah. And by the way, Simon, you are absolutely right about what you're telling Franklin. And Franklin, if you're still here, I hope you're still here. Let me just reiterate to you and to everyone else. Lack of understanding of history is what got us into this mess in the first place and got us to this point where Israel and Palestine do not talk to each other but want to kill each other. Lack of understanding and learning from history. That's what Hegel said. We've learned from history that we've never learned from history. Creative, I don't know what you mean by that. Ryan saying, question, is there a chance in the multi-party Canadian political system for a smaller party, example, Green Party of Canada, to have it? Yeah, so again, I'm not huge into modern politics. I try to be as objective as possible, not give my opinion. Most people are of the thought that Prime Minister Trudeau of the Liberal Party, which the Green Party is part of a coalition, will lose to Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives and the Reform Party next year. We'll see if that happens. The way American politics works, Americans don't understand the difference, is you have 2 major parties who control basically 90 to 95% of the vote secured every time, the Republicans and the Democrats. But in Israel with the Knesset, in Germany with the Reichstag, I think they still call it the Reichstag, the British Parliament, the French Parliament, and the Canadian Parliament, you have different political parties that agree to work together and form contracts called coalitions in order to get a majority. So, for instance, here's a quick history lesson from Nazi Germany. In the 1930s, the Third Reich, the Nazis, never got more than 40% of the votes in Parliament. They allied with other right-wing parties who believed that they would be more preferable than socialism to gain the power and the foothold that they eventually gained. Political parties have done this everywhere, where basically one party has like 30 to 40% of the votes, and they group with other parties to get over that 50% margin. And because it's a prime minister at the head of the parliament, they don't have an executive like in the United States, there's no checks and balances really, so the prime minister and the parliament control the government to a large extent, and the other party plays watchdog. So in Canada, the Green Party is part of that Liberal coalition. Ryan, I don't know if that can happen. I think it's a little bit better of a chance than here in the United States with the Green Party winning. But yeah, just a little quick geopolitical history lesson there. Thank you, Josh. I really appreciate that. You are absolutely awesome for pointing out how awesome VLAMP is. And yes, help us build the Legion to 6,000. We are almost at our hour right now. Yes, creative. Please do not make me laugh. Well, I'm not trying to make you laugh. There isn't such a thing as Christian phobia. We don't have a Christophobia where we actually try to censor people who are spreading misinformation about Christians. And I'm not saying that there are a lot of people doing that. There are some who are certainly doing that with Islam. The hatred of Islam, especially in the West, has been propagated by terrorist activity that has been conflated with all of Islam. And I know better. I know that doesn't reflect all of Islam. Unfortunately, it represents a disproportionate amount of Islam right now. Inside world. How about Dutch? What about the Dutch? I love the Dutch people, the Dutch history. By the way, the 17th century in Europe, the Dutch were the predominant power. They had the best navy and the best trading empire in the world before the British got there. So, in your opinion, who owns America today? I'm not going to give who owns America. I think we have a huge corporate landscape that has a lot of influence politically, socially, and economically. I never said I'm condemning. I never said I'm okay with that happening. I've never said I'm not condemning people dying and civilians dying in warfare. I think it's an awful, terrible thing. I am a historian. I know for a fact that it really is a recent phenomenon that we are so gung-ho to stop to avoid civilian casualties in war. But yes, we are coming up to the end of our time slot. So if you have questions, I may not get to them, but I'm going to try to wrap up and get through as much of this as possible. Sabrina, hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm so glad to see you. From India, well, awesome. Yes, it was, the wine wasn't the same. Bengal. Yeah, that's the whole, well, they didn't have gas lamps in Egypt, but it is supposed to be kind of that gas lamp style. It's got the Tiffany slats here with the little curves. It's supposed to resemble Tiffany or Baroque style. I wasn't in high school with you, Emil, but thank you for joining us. I appreciate that. I actually work in a liquor store in the north of Iraq. Wine, actually, the best things you have in Iraq. Interesting. The best wine in the Middle East is from Iraq. I'll have to try out Iraqi wine sometime. Yes. Did the UK take out the Palestinians out of Israel back in the 1940s or something? No, Luis, not quite. The British basically agreed through the Balfour Declaration of 1917 that Israel would have a right to have its own country. There had been a movement for about 40 years before then of Jews fleeing persecution, normally in Eastern Europe, to go to Israel, to go to their homeland. Some of them went to the United States, but a lot of them decided on their ancestral homeland of Israel to be their new country. And they started to set up their own society there. And it was eventually decided that there should be an Israeli state in the Levant. And they didn't know exactly what they looked like. That region had been called Palestine ever since Hadrian had defeated a Jewish revolt in 136 and kicked them out of the land, basically, and renamed it Palestine. I think that really they didn't kick them out, but it was basically the Israelis took over that land and the Palestinians had to leave. Meanwhile, different Arab countries kicked out all the Jews living there who all went to Israel. There were 200,000 Jews who lived in North Africa and in the Middle East who don't live there anymore, and there are very few Jews. I mean, there was a rabbi who was just killed in the UAE by the Iranians. So there's very few Jews living in the Middle East, as opposed to there are millions of Arabs who live in Israel to this day. So yeah, there was definitely flux where the Israelis took over land that didn't belong to them and kicked out the Palestinians and renamed the villages. There's no doubt about that historically either. Okay, Franklin, I do not like the term right side of history. There is no right side of history. Maybe you're on the wrong side of history and we just haven't found out yet. Could it be that you're on the? I do not think there's a right or wrong side of history. History is an objective science. It does not, and when I mean an objective science, I mean it has a methodology. It does not say this was a morally right or wrong action. So, I hope we do not, Rob. I hope everyone stays safe and everything. Global, what is the oldest history known? I would say the Sumerians have the oldest history. The early cities of Ur and Uruk and the settlement of those lands, the earliest cities 4,000 to 4,500 BC in Sumer, But you could also argue that prehistory is history, and you have artifacts, your domestication of wildlife, especially horses, become extraordinarily important, and people were living on farms and building settlements thousands of years before Ur and Uruk were built. So, but historians typically define the start of history as people living in cities and writing things down. That's where you get it from. Eric, what states have major upticks in votes for Biden? Huh? I don't know what you're talking about, Eric. I'm not investigating that. I'm not a historian. I'm not a politician. What do I think about Winston Churchill creative? Well, I think that Tucker Carlson and Jimmy Doyle show that they didn't know anything about Winston Churchill when they did that special on him. I think Churchill is a complex figure with a lot of problems and shortcomings. He had very racist language, especially about the Afghanis and Africans. I think he believed wrongly, like many Europeans had for a long time. He's a victim of his time in that way, that the developing world, the countries that have been colonized by Europe and Asia and Africa, deserved their lot and were better off when they were colonized. And there were some side benefits brought by the colonizers. There's no doubt about that. We can't argue that, but we can say that obviously the oppression probably outweighs that. At the same time, I think Churchill was extraordinarily incisive. He was very brave, and he had a lot of foresight. Not only did he see the Nazi threat ahead of time in Great Britain and Europe, but he saw that appeasement would not work. He also saw the predominance of America during the later half of the 20th century and the threat of communism in the Soviet Union, and was the only British politician who insisted that the British help the White Russians defeat the Reds and in communism in Russia in the late 1910s after World War I. Yeah, Stonewall Jackson had a sad ending. Definitely, Michael. Hello, welcome. I'm going to speed round through these to try to get as many answers as possible. Can you explain why didn't America execute the Japanese emperor? Because they needed him, because they used him, because he was willing to give up power and admit that he wasn't a god, and because he was willing to pose with MacArthur, where MacArthur is shown as taller than Hirohito, because that was such an important thing to the Japanese culture, and because they wanted Japan to become an ally and to become more Americanized and become a conduit for the West. They decided to let them have their toys. And one of their toys was their cultural heritage of having an emperor who is supposed to be a god in Japanese culture for thousands of years. I've never fought in war. You go ahead and spread that love, Cliff. Whatever you want to do. I don't think I'm angry. I don't get angry on the channel. That's an interesting perspective, Charlie. I hope you're wrong. I hope that it's not a genocide in the making. Hello, can you say about Ukraine and for the appointment need help because we lose nuclear weapon? Well, I think the war is coming to an end in Ukraine. I really do. Yes, thank you, Underboss. It's great to see you. I don't like that term Tatty Trump. It's just so cringy. Yeah, well, Michael, inflation is an ancient concept. Inflation happens when you take the money away from the people and you give it to, you take it off of a standard and you either devalue the standard or you take it away entirely. The standard for the American dollar today is the American dollar. That's a repetitive one-legged stool circle that's going to collapse in disaster. I have not. That's a great question, Global. Have you participated in a public debate? And it's so good to see you, Global. I love your questions all the time. And what would a history debate topic be? Well, obviously, a history debate topic would be who is at fault for the issue in Israel-Palestine. There's a topic right there. Or what were the causes of a civil war is one. Or when did the Roman Empire fall? Did it even fall? I have not participated in a public debate, although I feel like I've been in one tonight. Yes, the energy crisis of the 1970s. Never forget. I can see your messages. I'm so glad you're here. Yep, Dom Pedro I basically established an empire because the Brazilians didn't want to be ruled by the Portuguese. King John III, who lived there for a while, they were so tired of him, they wanted the Portuguese to not rule over them anymore, so they asked his son, Dom Pedro, to become their emperor instead. You cannot swipe? I hope you mean swipe left. Yep, I remember that. Well, I don't remember it, but I've read about it for sure, Michael. Yeah, I'm trying to go through. History repeats, but you and I don't. Yeah, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. I like Mark Twain. Um, yeah, we're going to get from Dubai, 6 a.m. And Simon's here at 2 a.m. He's been here for a long time. We're going to wrap it up here. Yes, I have learned about that open. If you guys haven't gotten, my last one I've gotten here is Seth. Yes, we are almost there. Thank you so much for your answer. My pleasure to answer as much as I can. Yeah, Portugal was the dominant power in the 15th and 16th century. Arian unfiltered. This is where we'll stop, although that screen name might need to be changed. This is where we'll stop. If you didn't get your question answered, I really apologize. We've been going for 70 minutes. My throat is extremely dry. But I am going to answer this question, and we're going to stop here because we've had so many great questions. If you enjoy learning about history and the content we talked about, consider liking and subscribing, checking out my short-form content, my long-form content. If you want to learn more about the history of Thanksgiving, I've got a bunch of stuff on in the last couple of days and a live stream lecture you guys can watch from Wednesday. But Arian, right now, Naranda, Narendra Dendra, I think is his name, or Dendri, Hodi. I can't say it. I always forget his name. The Prime Minister of India is trying to change India's name because India is based in the Indus River Valley. That's where the name comes from, which is in Pakistan, which is not part of India. So as part of the nationalist movement in India, the Indians are trying to rename their country Bharat, which is what the ancient Sanskrit name for the country is. So there's a little something about the current situation in India. It's very nationalistic. But anyways, I hope you've enjoyed the history that we've been able to bring to you, and I hope you enjoy this channel. Like and subscribe. Join us tomorrow. And if you were not able to get your questions answered, Simon has been filtering through them. He will tell me tomorrow, and we will come back and join us at 7 p.m. Eastern time, and I will answer your questions. And those who were at the who were last will be first tomorrow. I'm looking forward to seeing you 7 p.m. tomorrow Eastern Standard Time. Take care and have a great Friday, and I will see you Saturday night. Have a great one. This is the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. Be sure to like and subscribe, and have a great night. Bye-bye now.